Okay, I feel many of us have had situations where we feel like everything is going wrong all at once. We can carry grief, and then someone lies about you, and then another person attacks your character, and then your friends disappoint you, all of these things, right? All the while, right, the people doing evil appear to prosper. And during moments like these, it's easy to ask, right, has God abandoned me? And in 2 Samuel chapter 16, we're going to see one of the Bible's richest chapters on suffering under God's providence, because David is about to lose almost everything in a single day. He's going to be deceived, he's going to be publicly humiliated, he's going to be falsely accused, and witnesses his own son dishonor his family. And yet, instead of grasping for control, David increasingly entrusts himself to God's sovereign hand. And this chapter is going to teach us how to distinguish God's discipline from Satan's accusations in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. Okay, so David has just fled from Jerusalem. This is the context. Absalom has now declared himself king, so we have a nation which is divided. David's trusted counselor Ahithophel has joined the rebellion, and the ark has remained in Jerusalem because David refused to he doesn't want to take God's presence out of Jerusalem for his own political advantage or anything like that. However, now David is going to journey eastward toward the Jordan, and we're going to see during this chapter 4 encounters that are going to reveal 4 different kinds of hearts. We're going to meet Ziba, Shimei, Hushai, and Ahithophel, okay? So Ziba is going to use generosity to advance himself. Shimei is going to use suffering as an opportunity for hatred. Hushai is going to risk everything through his loyal service. And Ahithophel uses extraordinary wisdom in the service of rebellion. So these 4 depictions are going to alternate between David's humiliation in the wilderness and Absalom's apparent triumph in Jerusalem. But the narrator of this sequence is trying to tell us something. The kingdom appears to belong to Absalom, but in reality, God's covenant with David has not yet failed. And the chapter is reminding us that God's providence is most active when his presence seems least visible. Very important point. So let's go through the first 14 verses. The focus is going to be on Ziba's deception and Shimei cursing David. So the first 2 characters that we're going to meet. Verse 1. When David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple donkeys saddled, carrying 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and 1 skin of wine. The king said to Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride, the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine is for those to drink who faint in the wilderness." The king said, "And where is your master's son?" Ziba said to the king, "He remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Ziba said, "I do obeisance. Let me find favor in your sight, my lord the king." Verse 5. When King David said to Bahurim, "A man of the family of the house of Saul came out, whose name was Shimei, son of Gera. He came out cursing. He threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. Now all the people and all the warriors were on his right and on his left. Shimei shouted while he cursed, 'Out, out, murderer, scoundrel! The Lord has avenged on all of you the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, disaster has overtaken you, for you are a man of blood.' Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, 'Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head.' But the king said, 'What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, "Curse David," then who shall say, "Why have you done so?'" David said to Abishai and to all his servants, "My own son seeks my life. How much more may this Benjaminite? Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord has bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on my distress, and the Lord will repay me with good for this cursing of me today." So David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along on the hillside opposite him, and cursed as he went, throwing stones and flinging dust at him. The king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. Okay, so biblical unlock number 1. Let's go through. First and foremost, we see Ziba appearing at this moment. So as David escapes Jerusalem, Ziba unexpectedly arrives, and he brings 2 donkeys, bread, raisins, summer fruit, and wine. Everything David's weary company needs. But on the surface, this looks like generosity. But it's important because the Bible often warns us against judging too quickly because we think it's generosity. David asks, "Where is Mephibosheth?" And Ziba claims that he has remained in Jerusalem because he hopes Saul's kingdom will be restored. And what happens is David immediately rewards Ziba by granting him Mephibosheth's land. In later, and we're going to see this in 2 Samuel chapter 19, that we're going to discover the truth of his actions, because Ziba has mixed his generosity with actual deception here. So we see here one of Scripture's most interesting and realistic portrayals of motives. People are rarely completely selfish or completely selfless. It is true that Ziba helps David here, but he's also going to manipulate David. So we see that sin is not the absence of every good quality, but also it can be the corruption of good gifts by one's selfish desires. Now here's something that's interesting. Between verses 5 to 14 we see Shimei, right? And Shimei says, get out, you man of blood." So Shimei actually believes that David stole Saul's throne through violence. However, we know, as we've read all throughout 1 Samuel, Saul repeatedly tried to murder David, and David repeatedly spared Saul's life because he believed that he was the Lord's anointed one. What's interesting, he refused every opportunity to seize the kingdom unlawfully, and yet Shimei completely misunderstands this. But does David interrupt him? No. Does David defend himself? No. Because even though Shimei's accusations are inaccurate, David knows he is genuinely under God's fatherly discipline for Bathsheba, what he did with Bathsheba. And this is interesting because this is what radical trust to God actually looks like. He even says, "Let him alone, for the Lord hath bidden him," right? The Lord is the one who has bidden him. The reason that I'm pointing this out is because it sounds like, did God command him to sinfully curse David? But there are 2 truths that we need to understand. Shimei is morally responsible for his own actions. Later, David will actually address them properly. But second, God can sovereignly use sinful human choices to accomplish his rightful or righteous purposes. A good example of this is when Augustine is referring or talking about children who are born through fornication. So even though fornication is a sin, the child who is born is God's gift to this world, and that's really important to remember. So God can accomplish his greater purposes, his righteous purposes, through sinful means, even through sinful human choices. God is not the one causing people to sin. We have actual free will. Okay, but the important thing to remember here is that this is the same mystery seen throughout Scripture, because Joseph's brothers sinned, yet God used their sin to preserve Israel through Joseph, right? Judas freely betrayed Jesus, but God used that betrayal to accomplish his redemption. God is not the author of evil, and David recognizes this. So he looks beyond Shimei to God. What is God doing in this particular instance? Okay, let's read verses 15 to 23. The focus here is going to be on the counsel of Ahithophel, and we're going to be focusing on 2 more characters in this instance. Verse 15, "Now Absalom and all the Israelites came to Jerusalem. Ahithophel was with him. When Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, 'Long live the king, long live the king.' Absalom said to Hushai, 'Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?' Hushai said to Absalom, 'No, but the one whom the Lord and this people and all the Israelites have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Moreover, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? Just as I have served your father, so I will serve you.' Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, 'Give us your counsel. What shall we do?' Ahithophel said to Absalom, 'Go into your father's concubines, the ones he has left to look after the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened.' So they pitched a tent for Absalom upon the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the oracle of God. So all the counsel of Ahithophel was esteemed both by David and by Absalom. So an interesting question we can ask is Hushai actually lying to Absalom? Right? Is he lying? And Absalom actually asks, is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend? Right? He's asking, because Hushai replies, long live the king, long live the king. And it sounds like a betrayal, but there's careful wording here, because he doesn't actually explicitly say to which king he means, right? His loyalty remains with David, and his mission was actually assigned by David himself in chapter 15. So what we're seeing here is that God is answering David's prayer, because a few verses earlier, David prayed, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And the means of answering that prayer is actually in the courtyard. Now, Ahithophel's advice is actually very shocking to Absalom, because Ahithophel basically tells Absalom to sleep with his father's concubines publicly. What? Why on earth would he say something like this? This is horrifying, it's sexual immorality, but what is it? What it actually meant in the ancient Near East is when you take the former king's concubines that publicly announce that you have permanently succeeded them. So he's saying that there is no reconciliation. Burn every bridge. There's no chance for reconciliation, okay? And we see that a tent is pitched on the top of the house. So we need to remember another rooftop here. What is the other rooftop we need to remember? 2 Samuel chapter 11, David first looked upon Bathsheba on a rooftop. So it's a symbolic place, right? The place where David secretly sinned is now the place where he is publicly humiliated. And what's more, Nathan's prophecy in chapter 12 is fulfilled basically word for word, right? I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. Okay, so what is happening here? God's discipline is not random, it's not vindictive. What's happening here is we're seeing the terrible seriousness of sin. David was forgiven, but the consequences of his sin continue unfolding. So, what is the deepest message of this chapter? The deepest message is that God's providence is hidden beneath painful circumstances, because David, what does he experience? False accusations, public humiliation, personal betrayal, family tragedy, all of the above, right? And yet, every event quietly moves God's purposes forward. And David's greatest victory in this chapter is a spiritual one, because he's increasingly learning to trust everything to God, his reputation, his kingdom, his future, and even his suffering. Okay, let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. As we've seen before, David, being a man after God's heart, fulfills Jesus Christ in a few ways, because both David and Jesus, they leave Jerusalem and they're rejected by their own nations. David and Jesus both cross the Kidron Valley. You can see that in John chapter 18, verse 1. David is betrayed by Ahithophel. Jesus is betrayed by Judas. David is cursed by Shimei, and Jesus is going to be mocked, ridiculed by the soldiers, religious leaders, and crowds. David also refuses retaliation, and Jesus fulfills that perfectly. Peter, for example, writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, when he was reviled, he did not revile again, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So there's a profound difference here. David's suffering is connected to his own past failures, but Jesus was completely and utterly innocent. And David hopes that God may restore him, but Jesus knows that his rejection will become the very means by which David and other sinners are going to be reconciled to God. So, David bears that fatherly discipline. Jesus bears defiant judgment, not for his own sin, but for the sin of others. This is why we read in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 3, that he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. The rejected king of 2 Samuel chapter 16 prepares us for the perfectly righteous king who willingly endured rejection so that his enemies may be the very ones he saved through his death on the cross for the salvation of the world. Okay, so how can we apply this chapter in our everyday lives? Our reputation is something that we value a lot, I think. And when you're misunderstood, when you're slandered or criticized, there is an impulse that you have to fight back. You need to say, absolutely not. That's not what happened. That's not what is actually the case. I need to defend myself here. I want you to resist that impulse to defend yourself immediately. And I want you to prayerfully examine your heart and receive any correction that God may be giving to you. The reason why is because God is the one who's in control, not you. And I want you to entrust yourself completely to God. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. We learned a few things. I think the most important thing is that human motives can be mixed, right? Sometimes it requires patience and discernment to actually determine what human motives actually are. Humility is important because we need to listen for God's voice, and we need to listen to God before we try and defend our reputation, our personal pride, reputation, all of those things. And that David's suffering reveals something remarkable about his spiritual maturity, which is born through discipline, and that the rejected David actually foreshadows the greater rejected king, who is Jesus Christ. Next time we're going to see in 2 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to see two counselors standing before Absalom with two radically different plans, and Ahithophel, who is David's ex-counselor, recommends an immediate attack that would almost certainly destroy David, while Shimei offers an alternative, and we're going to see how that's going to play out in tomorrow's chapter. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.